Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your patience as I was off campus yesterday. Today, we're going to continue talking about Macbeth for scenes 2 and 3, which are the most important scenes, I would say, especially for the rest of the plot that's going to unfold. This is King Duncan's murder and their reactions for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and then ultimately the way that it unfolds in front of everybody at Inverness. So, if you click on my notes, they're quite lengthy today and they are set up by each particular scene. So, scene 2 is where King Duncan is murdered, and at the beginning of scene 2, we have Lady Macbeth very bold. She's filled with this anticipation about what's to come, and ultimately, she knows and admits to herself that she would never have been able to murder King Duncan because she says that he resembled her father when he slept. And that's the only vulnerable part we see so far about the change in her character. And so Macbeth is fearfully distraught. He is terrified, looking at the blood on his hands. He is so much in shock that he still has the daggers, and he hallucinates hearing these voices talking to him that sleep has been murdered. There will be sleep no more. And this alludes to the fact that King Duncan was murdered in his most vulnerable state in his sleep. And then the fact that, the guilt will haunt Macbeth and he will no longer be able to rest comfortably and live with what he's done. So at this point, upon seeing the daggers, Lady Macbeth, is angry. She chastises him and says she'll do it herself in terms of making sure the guards are framed. So she takes the daggers and smears the blood all over the guards and leaves the daggers there so that way they can ensure that they are free from consequence when everything is about to hit the fan. And so symbolically, at the end of scene 2, both of them have blood on their hands. So it's really important that you understand the differences between the way they react to the blood on their hands. And ultimately, we hear knocking, and it's quite loud and urgent. And Macbeth wishes that this knocking could do something at the end of scene 2. So make sure you know what that is. So, scene 3, we get the porter. And if you know anything about Shakespearean plays or any plays of this time period, when there was something so tense, there was always some sort of comedic relief. Remember, people go to be entertained. And remember, their values in terms of the hierarchy is that you have God, then the king, then the rest of the nobles and peasants. And so, when you have a scene where a king is murdered, that's a really heavy scene, right? That's hard for people to watch, even though they know that it's not real and it's just a play. So the porter comes in to lighten the mood, and he is so drunk he can barely get to the gates. And ultimately, he's imagining himself as the porter to hell, which is ironic because everything's literally about to go to hell, and the ultimate sinner, the murderer, is inside the castle. He kind of talks a little bit about, when he meets Macduff and Lennox and lets them in, he talks about kind of what drinking does to people and how alcohol affects different types of things. And at this point, people would have been roaring with laughter, right? Because it was funny and it was something that people in the audience could have related to. So at this point, when we meet Macduff and Lennox, they are talking about how the night was rough and how the natural order has been disrupted. Chimneys have been blown off. The air was strange. They could hear these screams of death. There were different birds that were, not following their normal behavior. And so they're setting all of this up to show that there is a natural or disruption in the natural order. And so when Macduff finds the king, he provides this religious imagery because remember, a sin against the king was essentially a sin against God because the king was the sovereign, he was the representative of God on earth. And so when Macduff talks about this, he makes it seem as though somebody was murdered in a church and people are confused. But then ultimately, they all kind of realize what has happened, and so at this point, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have switched roles in terms of appearance versus reality. So we see Macbeth not being able to function at in scene 2 when he murders Duncan. And now he is the one who is furious upon seeing Duncan's dead body, especially when it appears as though the guards have been the one to do it. So he murders the guards in front of people to show that he is outraged and that he vows to avenge, the king's death. And this makes him look credible, right? This kind of frees him from being a suspect, if you will. And at this point, Lady Macbeth knows her place, and she is, faking this, shock and devastation. She is confused and helpless. And I think at one point she even says, "What, in our house?" And I think it was Macduff or Banquo who says, "It would be a tragedy in anybody's house. Like, why are you talking about in this house?" Right? Like, that's a weird thing to say. But then ultimately she kind of starts pretending to faint to kind of draw attention away from Macbeth because he's starting to get too bold about his reaction. And so she's like, "Calm it on down, like you've done it. Just chill. Let's figure this out." And so at this point, we see Malcolm and Dolbane, and they are the king's sons. And remember, Malcolm has been previously named as the Tanist, or the king to be, the Prince of Cumberland. And so they have an aside to each other, and they say, "Whoever has murdered our father is still here." They're not buying the fact that the guards would have done this. The guards have nothing to gain. And so they say, "Whoever has betrayed our father can definitely, betray us." And especially knowing that Malcolm is the one to assume the throne. So they decide that they will mourn later, and they decide that it is best to separate. And one will leave for England, and Dolbane will head to Ireland. So at this point, this is suspicious behavior to everybody else. Why would his sons leave when his father has just been murdered without saying anything to anybody? And so they are questioning, the rest of the men, Macduff, Lennox, Macbeth, if you will. They're all questioning the involvement of the brothers within this murder, and now that has really changed who they're going to blame. And so ultimately, your reading response question for today really is about what the brothers decide to do, where they decide to go, and why. And then ultimately, what are your thoughts about their reactions? So are they right to assume that? Do you think about the reactions to people leaving, to the sons leaving? Are they justified in being suspicious? Any crime show you've ever would have seen, think about the way that people are questioned, right? They're questioned about their reactions. They're questioned about, well, why would you have said this? Why would you have done this? Leaving the scene of a crime is not common for people who aren't innocent, kind of thing, right? People who want to um, not make it seem as though they're suspects tend to run or tend to try to fly under the radar. So I just want to know what your thoughts are about their decision, and where they decide to go and why. All right, tomorrow we will finish Act 2 with Scene 4. Make sure that you are updating your notes. Consider how all these characteristics of these different characters are changing, because that will help you in your research piece later on. All right, guys, have a great Thursday. One more day, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.